Well, thank you all for coming. Good Abend. I'm Carol Teagarden, and on behalf of the Temple Sinai Women's Chavurah, I would like to welcome you to the Joys of Yiddish, everything you wanted to know, but were afraid to ask. Please be sure that you're muted during the presentation, and you are welcome to enter questions and comments in the chat box, which will be answered as time permits. So without further delay, we welcome Temple member, dance instructor, klezmer musician,
All right.
Yiddish maven, and so much more, Esther Brill.
Carol, thank you. That's a great introduction. I forgot some of those things. So I'm going to be a talking head, and I'm keeping you all on gallery view because since it's too big a group to interact in this format, I'm going to just be saying show of hands who. So if you want to see who and how people respond, keep to gallery. It's just going to be my voice for the most part. And then Carol Teagarden will manage the chat. And thanks to Carol Teagarden and Carol Yunker, who is on my screen. There she is, waving for Women's Chavurah. So you can all see me and hear me? Okay, thank you. So this is a fun overview in English, but I was challenged with not only the joy of Yiddish, oftentimes referred to as the joy and oi of Yiddish, but also everything you ever wanted to know, but were afraid to ask. So this is a kickoff to any directions you might want to go in, and there are lots of options for that. Happily, that we can talk about, including an adult ed course that I'll be offering in more depth on a weeknight in the winter. So my Yiddish journey did not grow up with any Yiddish, no clue, nothing. My father happened to be a conservative rabbi, and he had to teach himself enough Yiddish to be considered a legit rabbi, but there was apparently not enough in his home for him to learn. So about 10 or so years ago at the JCC, RJ saw a flyer and said, wouldn't it be fun to learn Yiddish? And that's the beginning of, I hate to use this word journey, but it's been 10 years of adult ed and self-education. And we owe a debt of immense gratitude to Debbie Rothman, if you know Debbie, who's quite a remarkable person, a native speaker, and essentially brought Yiddish into the lives of many of us. Right now, who are sort of graduates of Debbie, there's about 24 of us, and 15 of us meet every Tuesday morning as a reading group, a reading circle, and we read Yiddish and translate, pick out what we want to read. A couple of folks are here, and I'm going to read because I can't find you all on the screen. Sylvia Rose is perhaps here. Janet Nemitz, wave. Reba Siltera. Reba went to Yiddish school in the New York area when she was young. Henra Briskin. And Henra had Yiddish in her family. And Arnold Chekhov, who is there with his daughter, Laura. Somebody wave there. So if you have any questions about what Yiddish means to them and you know them, feel free to get in touch. And one last thing, please feel free to contact me or email me if you have thoughts, ideas, corrections in terms of what I'm saying, because this is an ongoing process. So we're ready to get started. And I have to give you my elevator speech. Does everyone know what an elevator speech is? Show of hands. Okay. In Judaism, that would be Hillel standing on one foot and telling what's Judaism all about. But nowadays we call it an elevator speech. So unfortunately, my elevator speech has 5 points. We're going up a very tall building. And we'll talk about why it's so long in a minute. I just need to say Yiddish. What does that word mean? Well, a Yid is a Jew. So Yiddish means Jewish. So sometimes you've heard people say, I speak Jewish. Did your family speak Jewish? It is Yiddish. And it's not pejorative. So if you're going to say like, oh, what's up in Yiddish, you would say, was machst a Yid? What's a Yid doing? What, how you doing? Was machst a Yid? And that's what the word Yiddish is all about. So 5 points. Yiddish is a real historical language. A real language, totally legit. Point 2, it was the language and culture of 3/4 of the Jewish people for a 1,000-year period of time. And it's still here, just like that Stephen Sondheim song, I'm Still Here. And that's the purpose of our hour together, to talk about that. Point 3, before World War II in Europe, there were about 11 million Yiddish speakers. 75 years ago in the Holocaust, we lost a preponderance of those speakers, and we lost the physical manifestation of their community. And we know that. Point 4, just as Judaism continues on, no matter what, we just celebrated Hanukkah, we're the people of the book. In that same mode, Yiddish language and culture continues on. You might use the word resilience, however you want to describe that. Our families might no longer converse in Yiddish. It's primarily spoken in the Haredi community. But as you'll see shortly, culturally, Yiddish is thriving. And you're here tonight because you maybe had an inkling of that and would like to know more about it. So finally, point 5 of this elevator speech, this resurgence in Yiddish has been going on for 40 years, since 1980. So that's a long time. We can all remember back to then, but 40 years is a long time that this all has been going on. So I cannot let you leave the Zoom until you're walking away with some aspect of this elevator speech, because what I'm wanting to do is dispel misconceptions. So Marilyn's point that I happen to see is that back in Germany in the Enlightenment, Yiddish was derided as a jargon, as an inferior language, a pidgin language, by people who took an intellectual view, by scholars. So if that flavor has somehow crossed your experience, it's a real legitimate language, and we'll talk more about that, but thank you for that question. If you think of it as a legitimate language, then a lot of that has false assumptions have been dispelled. Real language and culture of 3/4 of the Jewish people for a long time. We lost the physical manifestation, but the culture prevails. And it is in resurgence all around the world. Okay, so we're good. So now we need to know a little bit more about what is this language. And I unfortunately need to give you another 5 points. And these are even more dense. So a little more looking back. I think we know that Hebrew, point 1, was the historic language of religious observance, the Torah, scholarship, prayer, as well as Aramaic. So that's called Lashon Kodesh. Lashon is tongue or language in Hebrew and Yiddish, and it's the holy language. And I always like to say that Hebrew stopped being spoken by Jewish people way back at the beginning of the CE. In the Roman times, they spoke Aramaic. they needed help with the Hebrew because they spoke Aramaic, and Aramaic was the Yiddish of its time. So that's a little sidelight, and we can develop things like that more if we study it in more depth. So if Hebrew was the Lashon Kodesh, Yiddish is called the Mama Lashon, the mother tongue. Yiddish was the everyday language of Ashkenazi Jews, Eastern European Jewry, and it was always along with their host country language. So it was never just Yiddish. They always had to know the language of the country they lived in for survival. So they had to know some Polish, they had to know Ukrainian, whatever area they were in, because that's how they survived economically and in terms of the government. But among themselves, Yiddish was the everyday language. So they prayed and studied in Hebrew Aramaic. This would be the men. They lived their communal lives in Yiddish, the Mama Lashon. And they interacted with their Gentile neighbors and the government in the host country language. Not all the men who were scholars might know that, but the women who went to market, you are for sure that they were able to sell their wares in whatever language they needed to. A little sidelight on that, because it was the everyday language, when you study Yiddish literature and culture, it's not about primarily God, Torah, prayer. It's about everyday secular things. So it opens a door. Most of us, when we go to Hebrew school or Sunday school, we learn about Bible stories and Jewish holidays. This is a much broader swatch of everyday life, because this is the life that people lived in Eastern Europe. So the question is, are we familiar with where this area was that we're talking about, where people spoke Yiddish for all these hundreds of years? If I say Pale of Settlement, anyone heard of that phrase? The Pale, P-A-L-E, of settlement? That was in the Russian Empire, and it was a restricted area that ran between the Baltic Sea all the way down to the Black Sea, where Jews actually had to live unless they had special permissions. And this went on for a couple hundred years. If they didn't live in that Russian Empire, they were nearby to the west in what you would think of as historically Poland. So in my mind, that's all that area.
So Esther?
Mm-hmm.
Deborah. So was the Pale of Settlement kind of like the reservation?
Yes. What a good thought. Yes, it certainly was. Wow. Mm-hmm. The res, yes. And you had to have paperwork to go and live anywhere else, special permission. There's so much interesting history there. Russia didn't have Jews, but when it gained territory, and RJ knows a lot more in detail, when it gained territory that was formerly Polish, it gained Jews. So that is an important part of history in terms of Russian treatment of Jews that they didn't really intend to have. So my question for this group is, show of hands, if this was the everyday language, how many in your family backgrounds were Ashkenazi or from that Eastern European region? Is it everybody here? That might explain our interest in this program. So this is 75% of Jews. I am leaving out the Jews who were Sephardi and Mizrahi because that's an entirely different cultural thread. And that's not, they don't speak Yiddish, correct. Now we're on to point number 3. Point number 1 was Hebrew was Lashon Kodesh. Point number 2 was Yiddish was the Mama Lashon. Yiddish is It's a Germanic language, such as Dutch. That's the best example I can give you. Some of our congregants, Sylvia Rose, Elaine Ustain, have lived in the Netherlands and have that familiarity. If you know German, you will find some ease in trying to learn Yiddish. But there's Elaine. But 20% of its vocabulary.
As I'm going to say, our language, English, is also a Germanic
Yes,
language.
thank you.
We're right in there, so.
English is also a Germanic language. That may be confusing to people, but absolutely. So a lot of the structure that we have in English language comes from Germanic basis. For Yiddish, 20% of its vocabulary, however, is Hebrew words. 20%, because, for example, if they were talking about Shabbos, they're not going to use a Germanic word for Shabbos because they already have the word that describes it. So words that have a connection with Judaism are going to be just as they were in Hebrew, but the pronunciation is different. And I'll come to that in a little bit. It's what we call an Ashkenazi pronunciation. But your takeaway is that it's 80% German, 20% Hebrew based, and then there's some extra percentages thrown in. There's some Slavic origin words, because when people lived in all these countries, there were words for everyday things that made sense to them. Like a kind of horse saddle or potatoes. In Lithuanian, the word bulbas, which is Yiddish, is a Lithuanian word. If you lived a little closer to Germany, in say Poland area, you'd call it kartoffel in Yiddish. So the Slavic words were somewhat localized. So that's our third point. It's a Germanic language. Fourth point, it's written in two ways. It can be written using the modified Hebrew alphabet. It doesn't need all the letters. It uses most of them, and most people who know Hebrew can pick that up pretty quickly. Who has ever seen a Yiddish newspaper say the foreword? I know Marilyn has. So that's what Yiddish looks like. The words are longer because they're German based, and German has lots of prefixes and suffixes. So if you try to read those Yiddish words, they seem like they go on forever, because they do. Because it's, and Hebrew, on the other hand, happens to be a very compact language, if you know about its prefixes and suffixes. So it's using either a modified Hebrew alphabet or transliteration. We all know what transliteration is. If we use a Reformed prayer book, the Hebrew is transliterated. We can read it using the English alphabet. So you can read Yiddish that way. It's just fine that way. Either way is fine. Some of us find, even with, say, Hebrew and transliterations, sometimes easier to read the Hebrew alphabet than that transliteration, which can be very confusing. So that's how it's written. Not everybody grew up in this country learning to write it. We'll get to that in a minute. And by the way, when you had the Forward newspaper, they had Yiddish printing presses and Yiddish typewriters. Probably has never occurred to you about that. Nowadays, this is point 5. Where does it live and thrive? 3 places: Haredi communities. It's their everyday language. They actually speak, mix a lot of English in, and we call that Yinglish. It's spoken there. You know, some Haredi Jews, when they want to go off the derech and leave that community, they haven't mastered their English because that's not necessarily what was spoken. It lives in college and university campuses around the world. It's taught like any other language for language credit. And finally, there's an array of organizations, that offer educational programs, cultural programs, online programs. And I have a list of those. If you email me, it's just a 2-page list of Yiddish resources if you want to know what are those organizations. We'll talk about one in a little bit. So that was a lot in the second 5 points. And Leslie's saying, what is Haredi? Thank you for asking. That's the I would say ultra Orthodox communities that live in, often will live in an enclave in New York or New Jersey. It's sort of a closed community. And they came over from Eastern European areas and take their names from many of them. Well, that's the Hasidim, the towns they came from, but there's Yiddish spoken, even in Rochester. The Chabad rabbis will speak Yiddish and can. So one last point on these 5 points. I am not a language teacher, and how Yiddish is taught as a language today is there many, many opportunities. The most interesting recent one is Duolingo. Do you know that show of hands if you know about language app on your phone? You can learn any language you want. Yiddish picked up 500,000 users in its first when it was first debuted. So you can learn on Duolingo. Carol Teagarden can point you in the direction of an online program that she studies in and is starting a beginner class. And any of these organizations on the resource list offer classes. Like everything else in certainly the Jewish arena, it's all blossomed with the pandemic in terms of remote learning opportunities, virtual opportunities. So that's, as Rabbi Till said on Friday night, that's one of the candles that we light, you know, one of the benefits, one of the things that's brought light into the world. So this is not about the language per se, or speaking the language. If you think about language, there's hearing, reading, writing, and speaking. Those are all different cognitive skills, and they actually come from different parts of the brain. I can read, I can hear. My speaking is meh, which is probably a Yiddish word, and I can write. And Irene Barkin was saying that she had this in her childhood, but right now it doesn't come out if she tries to speak. But it's all in there. It's like riding a bicycle. And of the people that I named in our Yiddish group, some people who started with Debbie 10 years ago didn't even read Hebrew. So you can start from anywhere. So what I want to talk about now as a Yiddish as a culture, it touches something that's sort of concern to people today in the world that we live in. What are our roots? What are our family roots? What is our culture? What is our history? This appeals a lot to the younger generation that is trying to figure out, as we know from the report, you know, the report I'm talking about, that young Jews, you know, they know they're Renee's saying it. Unmute.
Pew.
The Pew report, thank you. She's going Pew. Young people today, they know they're Jewish, but they haven't figured out what that means. Well, there's an appeal to them in the study of Yiddish because it's, I'm just going to use that word, secular. Does not require belief in God or knowing Bible stories or the Torah. It's about people that really lived, people that came over here in this country as immigrants. It's a real story. It also has nothing to do with the state of Israel, other than Zionism being a movement. So it goes in a channel that is pretty much unexplored. And those of you that have younger family members may have had these kinds of discussion with younger people in your family. So I want to go back to how everybody here, which seemed to me to be everybody's hands showing, Ashkenazi, we call it Yiddish in der Heim, in the home. I got responses from 6 congregants, Jill Stanger, who's I hear, if she waves, I know she's somewhere, Jill Orbach, Liz Ornstein, I think Liz is here, Judy Weinstein, I think is here, Elaine Usdane is here, and David Kotak. And they all wrote stories of what Yiddish was like in their home with their parents, their grandparents. And they're absolutely wonderfully rich stories. And what I'm asking them to do is, with their permission, I'd like to share them with you because they're priceless. And I could not do them justice other than you having the opportunity to read them. The commonality of their stories was that this is a refugee, immigrant, melting pot, American story of first and second generations coming here. A lot of that is similar to other folks that came over, Italians, from Irish, Germans from different countries. The language was spoken when the parents or the grandparents didn't want the children to understand. It was discouraged or not encouraged because if you wanted to get ahead, you got to know your English, you have to have education. And the story of Jewish immigration is this immense upward mobility from one generation to the next, and overcoming economic barriers in this country in very creative ways. So that's the commonality of everybody's Yiddish in their home, in the home story. It was not spoken. And everybody says with regret, you know, if only my grandfather, if only my mother would have spoken with me. To give you a little bit of context on that, there was a 40-year period starting about 1880. This is astounding, when 2 million Jewish people came over from that Eastern European area to the United States. It started in 1880. It mostly ended in 1914 with the start of World War I. And the immigration quotas and nativism took hold, and both in 1921 and 24, there were severe restrictions. So you could not, if you were Jewish, very hard to get over here after 1924. People left. A lot of people say that, you know, that comes to mind, oh, they left because of pogroms. Well, that is indeed true. But the other reason they left, our ancestors, our grandparents, great-grandparents left, was socioeconomics. It was largely pre-industrial for them. There was a high birth rate, which was a mark of success. There were lots of Jewish children, but lots of mouths to feed. The shtetl is mostly a story of mud and poverty. And limited economic opportunity for Jews. And so with the poverty and hunger, they came here where allegedly the streets were paved with gold. That's, you know, and they ended up, many of them, in sweatshops. But that's that immigration story. 2 million people is a giant number of people. It sort of depleted the Pale. So it was be like you were living there and suddenly your shoemaker, your butcher, the guy who shoed the horses, they had all emigrated. So it was a very startling and dramatic situation. Already in this country, the Sephardi Jews came earlier. in revolutionary times, you know, the synagogue in Truro, and there's a synagogue in New York City. German Jews came in the 1850s because they had some famine and economic conditions there. But the Eastern European Jews came after 1880 and then were stopped cold. And we know, of course, what happened to anyone who was not able to leave Eastern Europe. Well, when they left, Yiddish culture came with them, and it was not only to here, it was to urban centers over the world. So Canada, that would be Toronto, Montreal, and we have Annette here who, you know, lives in that that culture now. Argentina, major center, and South Africa. The spoken language might have diminished, but the cultural aspects remain. So up to now, so that's a little bit of history of how we got here. Up to now, you still haven't heard Yiddish other than Was machst du Yid and Good Abend and maybe new. So I'm going to attempt to screen share and give you some really authentic Yiddish. You will know immediately.
Esther, it's Annette. Can you hear me?
Yes.
A lot of it's in our DNA. We think we don't know, but it's there. It's there.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And thank you for saying that, because right now you're going to have some DNA experience.
Verbroche und Atzloche, Verleben und Gesundsein, in a gute und a mazeldike Show, Lechaim, soll sein. Lechaim, 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 soll sein. Doch wir noch lebendig und freilich sein, weil wie am Ella sein. Lechaim soll sein, mit Glück, Lechaim, Lechaim, Lechaim soll sein. Das Leben ist ein Mischmasch für uns, macht es bloß als von uns. Lechaim soll sein. Beiso macht lo Beichagecho, steht bei uns ein Possi, freuen wir sich doch. Besser statt zu sagen Echo, macht man sich a Simche, will man Simches noch. Soll sein, Dick, Lechaim, Lechaim, mein Tochter, mein Weib. Das ist a Sibbe, a Tracht zu tun, Chibbe, a Schnaps zu tun. Lechaim, soll sein.
Okay. I have to get my view back. Oh, stop share. Okay. Whew. So, did you have any trouble understanding what that was? So, Fiddler on the Roof, Broadway, 1964. In Israel, in 1965, Kanar al-Hagag, thank you, Marlene. Kanar al-Hagag, original cast recording. They did it in Hebrew. And later that year, same producer said, why not do it in Yiddish? Because they could. So this is Fiddler auf dem Dach. Fiddler auf dem Dach, roof. So this is the original cast recording, which I just played you. Shmuel Rudinsky is a Polish emigre to Israel. So he has the most pristine accent. There happened to be sort of a genius actor who was able to translate this. Remember, it was English, written in English by 4 Jewish men who were sort of assimilated and then translated to Hebrew and then to Yiddish. Anybody pick up any words? Show of hands. L'chaim is the same in Hebrew and Yiddish. Yeah.
My mom did.
Yeah. Yeah. Wonderful. Thanks, Sal. That's great. So in 2018, I could have played you another recording because in 2018, Fiddler auf dem Dach ran in New York Theater for a one-year run, an entire year, and was poised right before COVID to tour around the world, traveling companies, and it will tour. With, super titles, how they do that. Nobody had any problems
Esther,
standing it.
our local Bruce Sabbath,
Yes.
Bruce Sabbath, he was
Was
in
it?
it and he did it.
Yes,
Yeah.
Bruce Sabbath was
on,
Laser
on
Wolf.
Broadway.
So
Yeah.
the guys that were in it on Broadway, I'm sorry, in New York, it was produced by National Yiddish Theater Folksbiene. Well, point one, Folksbiene was founded in 1915, and it's been in continuous operation ever since. It's more than 100 years. Bruce Sabbath, who is from Brighton and just did a show at the JCC. Anyone see it? His story about Tavia. He was Laser Wolf. Okay, so this cast, they don't know Yiddish. They don't know from Yiddish. So they learned it quickly with some good tutoring. Some of them might have known Hebrew. Some of them were not Jewish. They all did a credible job of performing in Yiddish. So we actually have someone in our Yiddish class, Davida Bloom, who's been in JCC Productions, who joined our Yiddish group because she wants to perform in Yiddish theater, because she's head of the drama department at Brockport, is in plays. But, prior to doing that, she had to learn Yiddish. So she has. It's a wonderful story. So who knows who is the original author of the material for Fiddler on the Roof? Anyone? Shalom Aleichem. I can see Annette's lips moving. Shalom Aleichem is from an area that we would now call the Ukraine. He wrote 8 stories over a period, 1894 to 1914, called Tavia the Dairyman. And these formed the basis of what was adapted into this play about Tavia and his daughters, and which was adapted for 1964 for the play. Shalom Aleichem is sometimes referred to as the Yiddish Mark Twain. He was a bit of a humorist. And of course, that he said that Shalom Aleichem, that Shalom Aleichem said that Mark Twain was the American Shalom Aleichem, of course. So I want to play you 2 more excerpts because I want to show you why the play, when Fiddler was written by these 4 assimilated Jewish, oh yeah, thank you, Judy. There was a Tevye film from 1939, and the story was not happy. It's not a happy story. When these 4 Jewish men in 1964 made this story, they were making the shtetl, romanticizing shtetl life and exile. But I want to show, and they also wanted to make it acceptable to non-Jewish audiences. You know that Fiddler is popular all around the world because the theme of family values, tradition, the old generation, the young generation, it played just as well in Japan as it played here. So I'm going to play you 2 more excerpts to show you what you can do if you have the play in Yiddish, for where you can acknowledge I want to play this.
Mir ist das so leicht. Wird ihr doch mis Tome fragen, was bleiben wir da sitzen, ob die Sakon ist so groß? Wir bleiben bei Lanatevki ist unser Heim. Und wie so halten wir das Tag aus? Auf dem hab ich ein Entfer. Gott ist ein Vater und heilig ist sein Teure.
It's really hard to stop playing fiddler music. You just want to just keep playing it. So that song in English was Tradition. And in this Yiddish adaptation that was done in 65, that word tradition was a lot more concrete. Jewish tradition is the Torah, die Torah. So that's what those words were, die Torah, the Torah. Torah is a Polish pronunciation of Torah. I want to play you one last excerpt from this with another Yiddish aspect that harkens back to Shalom Aleichem. So listen for this one.
Euer Rebbeinu Shalom hast doch beschaffen eine Welt mit eurem Leid. Und wissen ihr doch, es ist gar nicht geschande zu sein an eurem Mann. Aber ein größer Covid ist es euch nicht. Ist was wohl schon gewesen so schlecht, wenn ich hab ja mein eigen bissel Hab und Guts. Wenn ich bin ein Rothschild, oh je didel, 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 dum. Ganze Tag wollt ihr sie bitte bam. Wenn ich bin ein reicher Mann, Hand in kaltem Wasser, nicht da reingetan und digi, 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 dum. Ich wohl gehad a Deidl Beitel Geld und gewinn a Deidl Edelmann. Oh.
So it's not if I were a rich man. Anyone catch it? If I were a Rothschild. If I were a Rothschild. If I were a wenn ich bin, which means when I would be, if I were a Rothschild. Rothschild is the richest Jewish man they knew of. Actually, what's so fun about that is that the Shalom Aleichem story that this was taken from is called Wenn ich bin a Rothschild. So Shalom Aleichem wrote a whole story in his humorous way about if I were Rothschild, I could have hot and cold water and stairs that went up and stairs that went down, and I could pray. So it was a whole long humorous piece. So this Yiddish Fiedler auf and Dach gives you the flavor of Shalom Aleichem, and it gives you some absolutely delicious language that you will not hear because no one can speak like that now. Sheldon Bach and Harnick. Oh, thank you, Susan. Bach and Harnick, who wrote Fiddler, also wrote the Rothschilds. Interesting. Okay, so I got to tell you a little bit about the name Shalom Aleichem, but by just having time to talk about Shalom Aleichem, it's sort of like this. It would be in American literature and culture if I got to tell you about Mark Twain, but never talked about F. Scott Fitzgerald, Hemingway, Robert Frost, William Faulkner, John Steinbeck. My drift is that's just a tiny drop in the bucket to our heritage, our culture. Yerusha is a Yiddish word for treasure, inherited treasure. This whole cultural blossoming has been since the time of Shalom Aleichem among Yiddish writers has been described as one of the most concentrated outpourings of literary and cultural creativity in all of Jewish history, the tangible legacy of life in Eastern Europe. And that's what was carried over by people who immigrated here to not only the United States and Canada, Latin America, other places. And it came here and carried on here The spoken language might have diminished, but other manifestations continued on. And this is what is able to be explored. Daily newspapers in cities all over this country and in Canada. You know, there was a Yiddish newspaper in Philadelphia, you know, just to say. There were numerous in New York City. The newspapers published serialized stories of contemporary Yiddish writers. That's how they made a living. There wasn't that much book publishing. You made your living by selling your serialized story to the newspaper. And if you ran afoul of a cantankerous editor who would not publish your stories, you were in trouble. The newspapers also published translations of classics of French and world literature, because the Jewish reading public was voracious in terms of reading. These might be people that worked in sweatshops, but the life of the mind continued. Yiddish was very predominant in the culture in terms of political and labor movements. Carol Teagarden knows some of that. There were many journals, including humorous and satirical journals. There were movements of poets, different kinds of poets, sweatshop poets, introspective poets. There were over a dozen Yiddish theaters on 2nd Avenue, and they put on plays every night. And you could have your pick of plays, and it was sort of improv because they couldn't possibly memorize all those plays. So they had the mother-in-law, the prodigal son, the weeping daughter. They had all these characters, and the audience, it was sort of like Shakespeare's time. The audience hooted along. It was not an orderly audience. So there were performing troops, drama and musical. This all led into what you're more familiar with, Borscht Belt humor, Jewish comedians. So a couple of remnants of this exist. The Yiddish newspaper, The Forward, exists today online. It's very lively. I might add, all the staff is women. This used to be the bastion of the cigar smoking Yiddish men. All women, very hip, very clever, very successful. And then Folksby in the Yiddish Theater continues, and it's very, very popular productions in New York. You know, there is a lot of interest in people's stories and cultures in our country right now. And that's a reflection of that. I want to, we have about 10 minutes more. I know this is so much material. I want to talk briefly about the resurgence in the last 40 years. How many of you knew that a Yiddish writer won the Nobel Prize? 1978, a Yiddish writer won the Nobel Prize, and he's probably the most well-known of all Yiddish writers. He wrote somewhat in English and somewhat children's stories. Anyone? Singer. Isaac Bashevis Singer won the Nobel Prize, gave a very famous speech, which of course, this is in Sweden, where he gave it in Yiddish, and he said, Yiddish has not spoken its last word. And he proved to be true. The final miracle of Yiddish was a young graduate student in Toronto. Do I have this right? Where's McGill?
Toronto.
Okay.
It's in Canada, somewhere in Eastern Canada.
His name is Aaron Lansky.
Montreal.
I'm embarrassed, yes. Montreal. His name is Aaron Lansky. His book is Outwitting History. He's about 65 now. So when he was a graduate student, Amherst Connection, yes. The Yiddish Book Center that he founded, Susan Rizzo says, is in Amherst, Mass.
It's an excellent book. I'm just going to jump in. Esther, thank you. Yeah, Esther sent it to me. I love it. I loved it.
I sent it to Annette. Yeah, it's a great book. This is just the most fun and astounding book you'll ever read. So he's a graduate student. He can't find any. He's taking graduate work in Yiddish with a very famous professor. There's few of them in the class. He can't find any books. She assigns a book to read. He has no Yiddish novel. He's supposed to read a novel and he can't find it. So he realizes in 1980 that there's lots of books around and lots of old Yiddish people who didn't know what to do with their books. And so he got this idea that he would collect the books. And the rest is history. He was flooded, and they had no idea how many were left or would be around. He was flooded with books. Oh, also no traditional Jewish organization wanted to help him. It was like, oh, we don't do that. That's not our mission. The legacy organization. So he quartered himself in Amherst because that's where he went to college, and it would just be like starting it in Rochester. Well, I know some people here. I got some friends on the U of R faculty and got some local benefactors. And basically, over these 40 years, they have collected 1.5 million Yiddish books from around the world. And not only have they collected all those books, they've distributed them to libraries and college campuses all over the world, so people have books. Thanks to Steven Spielberg, they created a digital collection of 13,000 Yiddish books at a push of a finger, downloaded 5 million times. And they're working now on teaching, translating. This is all vision of one person. And he takes his title, Outwitting History, from a Yiddishist, a very famous Yiddishist, Max Weinreich, who has said, Yiddish has magic, it will outwit history. So this is the story. And it's an amazing story. And Marlene just visited there. Anybody else been to Yiddish Book Center? If you're ever, Marcia, great. And of course, Arnold had a photography exhibit there. So he knows directly. He knows.
And I'm chiming in. My first short film ever was on the National Yiddish Book Center when they were a warehouse, not in their current location. They were just a giant warehouse, and they let me wander around with my little camera and just capture whatever I could. So I'm wondering if I still have that somewhere.
Find it.
Yeah.
Oh,
it's an
and
amazing.
Susan says Lansky graduated from Hampshire College, which is a non-traditional program that probably encouraged him. Right, he lived in Amherst and he went to Hampshire. Thank you.
That's where it is.
And it is on the campus of Hampshire College. And Hampshire allowed it to buy the land, which is quite provident that occurred. So Yiddish has its magic. I just need to show you this book to prove that Yiddish indeed has its magic. Because if this cover looks familiar, this is a Yiddish version of Harry Potter, which sold out several printings and was printed in Sweden. Very base. So in our last few minutes, I just want us to be able to run through a few words. This is fun. And a sort of show of hands. So I'm going to talk about Yiddish at Temple Sinai. How many of you go to Temple? How many of you go to Shul? I go to Shul. How many of you say Shabbat Shalom? How many of you say Good Shabbos? How many of you say Hag Sameach? How many of you say Good Yontif? Good Yontif means good Yom Tov, good day, good day. How many of you say Yom Kippur? How many of you say Yom Kippur? That's the Yiddish Ashkenazi pronunciation. Torah versus Torah. I can hear Rabbi Ket saying Mazal Tov. I say Mazel Tov. That's the Ashkenazi Yiddish pronunciation. Do you call it a talit or a talis? And is it a kippah or a yarmulke? So if you go to shul, do you daven? Or do you see people davening? I know you do this, you schmooze. Okay. I don't know how many at our temple are from. But if you're from, you would know about melchig, fleischig, and treif. Also known melchidika, fleischidika, and treifidika.
You could just be Reform and know those terms too. Some of us do. Some of us do.
And Temple Sinai does have rules for melchidika, fleischidika, and treif. We do have a policy. Yes. There's Diane Strager is saying it's a Yiddish word of the day. It's on the resource list. She's charming. And it's on YouTube and Facebook, and it's on the resource list. You can focus on some of the fun words that she picks out. She also wears a different outfit every day, a different color top. I have no idea how she does that. So some words are still in Yiddish. Yortzeit. Yortzeit is untranslatable, year, time, the time of the year. It means something different actually in German. We recently had for Elisa's family an aufruf. There's no other word for that. It means in Yiddish, call up. Roof is call, off is up. I know there's no other word for pushke or pushki, right? And I just heard Elise use this on our Hanukkah candle lighting, machatanim. Machatanim, you had to be there. No other language has that. It's your spouse's parents. And there's all kinds of your machatanista, the mother and the, so machatanim. So the resource list question was, Leslie, just email me and I'll send you that because that's lots of things to explore online. Some fun words, and we'll explore this more in adult ed. Oi gewalt, and oi vesmir. Sylvia Rose told us today that her 7-year-old Annie goes around saying oi gewalt. You probably have to hear it. New. They didn't, the COVID Omicron, they skipped new. They literally skipped N, the new, because it was as a variant. That would have been unsupportable. Splendidly untranslatable chutzpah. You tell me what that means. You know it when you experienced it, right? This was used for Monica's Hanukkah fair, tchotchke. And the one word that has many meanings, shmata. It's just sort of something that you wear that's a shmata. Some other words, kibbutz. Kvel, we all know what kvel is. It actually comes from, the word itself in Yiddish means gush or swell. So it's that kind of overjoyed feeling. Kvetch, our teacher Debbie had earrings, kvel and kvetch, that her students gave her. Kvetch means squeeze or press. Schlep, and Maven, which was in Carol's introduction of me, thank you. And of course, mensch, which is gendered, but we all know what a mensch is. And I guess I'll end with body parts, pupik or pipik and tuchas, which are very descriptive. In saying all these two things, a lot of this vocabulary has entered American popular culture. I don't want to reduce Yiddish to punchlines from comedians, but it's a way to make it accessible and fun. It's very expressive. There's a word in Hebrew and in Yiddish called tam, and it's just the flavor of Yiddish that's expressive. And one last point, pronunciation differences. How many of they're regional, and as Carol was saying at the beginning, there's like two major divisions, but actually more. One of the most, and the pronunciations differ mostly in the vowel diphthongs. One of the funniest is my grandfather, Brill, was a Litvak, and he married a Galicianer, and it was considered an intermarriage. It was because of cultural differences. Litvaks were pretty straight-laced. That's the stereotype. So there will be regional pronunciations. How many of you say kugel? How many of you say kegel? So it depends where either you grew up or where the people that you heard speak the words, as Irene was talking about in her family, came from. So that was everything. Soup to nuts. And it is 8 o'clock. That's sort of our Zoom contract. So if you want a resource list, I'm happy to email. And
Esther, I wonder if we could actually put a link to if we could scan it and put it on the adult ed page for anybody who wants to access it, so you don't have to send it out.
Sure.
I wonder, Susan, if we could figure that out together.
There, yeah.
I don't know if Women's Chavurah has a page, but of course, they have first crack at her. Otherwise, adult ed is happening.
I'll send you this as a PDF. It's just a list of Yiddish resources, and it's sort of fun. And then lots of other avenues for you to explore, mostly online. Everything is on YouTube. So you can see all kinds of video, and there's all kinds of educational opportunities online. If you have a specific desire to follow up in any way, Carol Teagarden has an immediate access for beginner course online, and that's affordable. And then many other organizations are offering all kinds of things. Very popular. So email me or call me, especially if your slant on things comes from another direction, because I want to absorb that. And I do want to get some permission to summarize people's Yiddish stories. I've heard back from Judy and from David Kotak, who are delighted to share their stories.
Yes, Esther, by all means. Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Jill. And Jill said yes. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
Esther, could you tell us again about the 3-part class that you're going to offer for adult ed? Just review that a little bit and what we should be looking for.
Yes, it covers the same material, but what we're going to do is once you understand about Yiddish, depending on people's background when they start, we're going to actually try to read some, to see it in Hebrew and then read it in transliteration, to just give you the sense of being able to do that. A lot more music opportunity, as much music as you might want, with the lyrics, because there's a whole story in music, with lyrics in transliteration, so they're very accessible. Lots of words like we went over that are splendidly untranslatable, that I culled from mostly Leah Roston to try to cover the gamut. And then also, last names. Thought we would spend some time with last names, which have meanings. Fenster. Trying to think of other things. I'm looking around for name. Suskin. yeah, Schwartz.
Birnbaum. Birnbaum.
Birnbaum is a very good one. Pear tree. Yeah, yeah. Berg is mountain. So, so we'll just go into more depth and cultural history. And there'll be an outline of that. Susan is our esteemed leader for adult ed, and there will be an outline of each week, and so you'll know what you're getting each week. And I think we'll try to explore more, what does that mean, cultural literacy? That's really what's been lost here, is our own cultural literacy. So,
will it be online or in person, Esther?
Depending on what we're able to do, and definitely online and in person if that is feasible. Assuming that we're all, whatever we are doing at Temple Sinai at that time. There have been several things that have been in person and online. So this won't be until after the first of the year. So we'll see what those things are.
Esther, I'm not able to get on to chat, and I just want to tell you it was a great presentation, and it's the best hour I've spent in a long time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Annette.
Bravo.
Thank you so much, Esther. This was just wonderful, and definitely going to pique our interest in a lot of different avenues of pursuing this language and culture. So thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you,
sharing
Carol.
all that you know.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
All right. Have a good evening, everyone.
Right.
Good.
Thank you